Welcome to What is Going On for new thought from the edge of Ohm. Each week on Ohm Times' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Ohm. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of a special 3-part series of interviews with speaker, researcher and author Paul Anthony Wallis, based on his latest work, the Eden Trilogy, which has been hailed as an extraordinary work of investigation that not only brings much humility and insight to one of the most contaminated fields of inquiry, 21st century ufology, but also provides a solid foundation in understanding humanity's origins. If you didn't catch our first conversation, Paul Anthony Wallis is a senior churchman who served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. He's the author of numerous titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality, and his work today probes the world's mythologies for their insights into human origins and human potential. Paul, welcome back.
G'day, Sandie. It's great to be with you.
You too. So in part 1 of this series, we discussed book 1 in your trilogy, Escaping from Eden. Does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? Today, we're going to focus on book 2, The Scars of Eden. Has humanity confused the idea of God with memories of ET contact? And this book chronicles your travels around the world, speaking with renowned researchers, contemporary experiencers, and others from numerous cultures whose ancient mythologies also describe ET intervention. So tell me about this secret commonwealth, as is mentioned in your book, in which many narrative traditions describe this covert layer of non-human interference or governance over humans.
Well, that's a great place to start, Sandie, because The Secret Commonwealth was a title of a book that was produced in around 1600 out of the work of a Scottish Presbyterian minister working in Aberfoyle, in the parish of Aberfoyle. And anyone who knows much about religious history will know I've just described a very conservative person. Robert Kirk was a very conservative person, but he was also a very sincere and compassionate pastor who, when he went to the parish of Aberfoyle, listened to his people and expected to learn something from them about what their experience of life had been through the generations in Scotland. And as he listened to his people, he was hearing a layer of story that startled him. And there were patterns in the story that were so repetitive and so compelling, and that was so much a part of the heritage of the families among whom he was working, that he had to start taking notes, getting his head around it, making sense of it. And he concluded, on the basis of that work of research, is what it really was, that there is a non-human layer to the governance of humanity. And that until you understand that, you won't understand a thing that happens on planet Earth. And the stories that he was hearing were not only of contact with non-human beings resident on the planet or visiting the planet, but of abductions, stories that would be quite familiar to the modern ear. And not just abductions for hybridization. So he was really in the deep end of the ET contact story, and he took it seriously. And he felt not only was this a part of the experience of human beings in his part of the world and around the world, but that it was essential to understand the reality of it if we want to understand who we are and what our place is on the planet. So that's where the name, The Secret Commonwealth, comes from. And as I discovered in my research for The Scars of Eden, this experience, this indigenous experience, belongs not only in Scotland, you can find it in Ireland, Wales, Africa, Mediterranean, India, the Americas, Africa. I discovered it in West Africa, Ghana, in the heritage of my own family. And it was when I made that discovery that I realized I had to make a personal journey around the world to sit at the feet of the elders of traditions who had curated these stories for generations.
Did any of what you discovered surprise you?
I was blown away. Yes, absolutely. The only thing I had ever heard about contemporary contact and the hybridization narrative and abduction narrative in my studies in spirituality was in chapter 6 of Genesis. And it's just an odd moment where this story of abduction for hybridization is mentioned so swiftly that it seems the writer thinks we all know about this anyway. Well, I didn't know about it. I found it there. I started studying it. But what really surprised me, to be honest, was discovering that it was in the history of my own family. It was in my own cultural heritage. And it was as I was preparing for the launch of Escaping from Eden, the first in the Eden series, that I was sitting down with my parents-in-law, who are from Ghana. They are Christians from Baptist Pentecostal background. And I suddenly remembered I had to tell them what my new book was about. All my previous books have been quite unworrying to them. But this one, suggesting that the Bible is full of stories of paleo contact, I thought might be a bit confronting for them. I'd better give them a heads up what was coming. So when they came and visited one weekend, when everyone was relaxed after a lovely lunch and some lovely food and drink, I said, Kofi Patience, let me tell you about my new book, and very nervously put forward my thesis to them. And they sat in stony silence that gave no clue as to what they were thinking about what their son-in-law was telling them, until I finally paused for breath. And my father-in-law sat back in his seat and he said, Paul, a penny has dropped. Meaning that there were many anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible, which he had spotted and never been able to get his head around. Suddenly they made sense that these are actually stories of visitation, colonization by ETs. They're not really God's stories at root. It explains some of the confusion, the conflict, the warfare, the violence. So he was doing that processing. And my mother-in-law, Patience, went forward and she said, Paul, we already know this story. Because in Ghana, you grow up and at school, you will learn the modern scientific view and you'll learn the Christian Orthodox view. But the indigenous knowledge of Ghana is that there is a non-human presence on planet Earth that is involved in abduction, hybridization, that is very possibly what today we would call an extraterrestrial presence, although the origins of this presence is shrouded in mystery. But all the elements that you're telling us about of contact are there in Ghanaian heritage. And that was the beginning of my going around the world and finding this story repeating in cultures all around the world with phenomenal details recurring from culture.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, growing up as a child, there was a poem that we learned, which was, went something like, up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a hunting for fear of little men. And it was all about these people who lived in the mountain, and they took away a little girl called Bridget, and she was gone for 7 years. And that's a poem.
Yes. Well, we've been taught to put that in a certain box, haven't we? So we know the poem, it's a fairy tale.
Yes.
And if I use the word fairy, we immediately think of Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, and might not know that the original fairy tales were stories far closer to modern ET abduction narratives, such as we would hear in the present day, and that the little men or the little people sound a lot more like the small greys, to use the modern nomenclature, than we might be comfortable with.
Yeah.
But you see, it's that language is there, I think, as part of it's a bias towards ridicule. with which we listen to these stories. And it's a bias that's been carefully curated, I think, by mainstream information curators to stop us asking too many questions about what really is going on.
Yeah. And we get told over and over again, don't we? Oh, it's just a fairy tale. I mean, it's interesting because as a child, I was, the books that I read as a 4-year-old, and I was a precocious reader, were all folk tales from different countries. And there were lots of them then. And I worked my way through them all because they attracted me. There was something in them that attracted me. But, and they were quite scary.
Disturbing.
Those,
yes,
very disturbing, those books. And your book is, full of, stories of the people that you've talked with, the different cultures. We know that the Hawaiians, they talk about coming from the Pleiades in a boat. That's their mythology, and there are other cultures that have very similar over and over again. Far too widespread not to take notice of.
Yes, that's right. And far too many details recurring for it to be coincidence.
Yes.
What I found interesting as I took a world tour of Indigenous story is that many of the points that recur appear to be a visual memory. So it's not that a book has gone around the world and been sort of rewritten by each culture. It's not an oral tradition that's gone around the world in Chinese whispers and been adapted. Very often you'll find that each culture has a very coherent way of describing a thing that was seen, and they'll have their own language for it, their own metaphor. But when you picture the thing, you're picturing the same thing from culture to culture. And one example of that would be that I would put my neck out and say most creation stories, when you listen carefully, turn out not to be creation stories. They're stories of a visitation that helps the planet recover from a catastrophe. And the things that were seen by the survivors at that time, those are the visual memories that recur from culture to culture.
Well, you say in the book that the removal of ET narratives from our official canon of science and history is a pattern that recurs through the ages. Tell us about some of the places you talk about: the Hebrew canon, the Catholic imperial forces, etc. Just give us an idea of how widespread that is.
Absolutely. Well, I begin my journey in the Bible with some translation, going to the root meanings of key words. And when you read the stories of beginnings in the Bible using the root meanings, another layer of story emerges. And it's a story of paleo contact, a story that says we have company, and in the past we were colonized by ET visitors. So someone might say, well, if that story is in the Bible, how come it's not obvious? How come it's hidden in plain sight? How was that narrative forgotten? And the answer is, well, quite deliberately. There is a forgetting that is commanded within the story of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. If you go to the Ten Commandments, for instance, Moses is telling the people not to work for the other powerful ones. We're not supposed to ask who they are. Not to work for the other powerful ones, not to bow down to them, not even to draw pictures of them. So a great forgetting is being commanded. Moses' successor, Joshua, says to the people, you must not work for the powerful ones. Now, this word gets translated as God, but it actually means powerful ones. Don't work for the powerful ones of the Egyptians or of the Canaanites. Don't work for the powerful ones our ancestors served when they were in Mesopotamia. We are going to work for Yahweh. And so there's a picture where Yahweh, the God of the people of Israel, is one of a whole number that you could choose to work for. But we work for this one. Well, that sort of gets airbrushed out so that you get further into the Bible, the idea of other gods sort of disappears. The other gods become fictions, except it doesn't make sense of the wars among the powerful ones, the thousands of human beings slaughtered in the conflicts of the powerful ones. You get to the 6th century BCE, that's the moment when, and there's a huge scholarly consensus that this was the moment when the Hebrew scriptures took their current form. And they did that as editors reworked this library of scrolls and stories into a single story. They morphed it into something that gives the impression of a seamless story of God Almighty from beginning to end. And one of the ways they did this was to import their holy name for God into earlier texts about powerful ones. And every time they made that translation choice, they were attempting to obliterate the memory of the powerful ones so that the stories change from being stories of paleo contact to being stories of God. They change from being stories of ET invasion and colonization to stories of acts of God. And there's a distortion in the stories that happened at that point in which you see God now being very anti-human, now being very violent, now going to war with himself, now being double-minded, making mistakes, failing to anticipate things a child could have anticipated. It's a very odd, violent, disturbing God that emerges because they've actually given the name God to a whole community of entities who were really at odds with each other. And that distorted image of God has really distorted Judaism and Christianity from that moment to this. Because if you worship a God who is genocidal, then you will justify genocide. You have to. If you worship a God who is so punitive that he will punish a family for 7 generations because of a mistake somebody made who was actually trying to serve him, you have to justify that kind of morality because that's the God you're worshipping. And so it distorts us. We shut down our own moral compass. We shut down our own intelligence because we think we have to justify and worship this divine activity, which it turns out wasn't divine at all. It was extraterrestrial activity. So that's one example in the history of the Jewish canon. But similar moments happened, as the Roman Empire, for instance, hijacked Christianity. It pared it down from this great kaleidoscope of gospels and theologies and experiences and practices, pared all that down. So you've now just got the canonical scriptures. The Gnostic scriptures are literally being buried in the desert to prevent them from being destroyed because of this climate of control. And it's pared down to a religion of worship and obedience with God and the emperor at the top, the bishops and the senators in the middle, and then the priests and the people at the bottom sort of taking orders, meekly praying, paying, and obeying. And it pushed out some of the more interesting elements that were part of kaleidoscope Christianity that were all about contact with ancestral spirits, contact with other spirits who the New Testament writers never quite define who they are or what they are, but they're not demons, they're not angels, there's some other kind of entity that's not quite defined. And that whole primitive experience of contact and communication was pushed out of the core syllabus of Christianity, so that Christianity becomes feudalism with a religious gloss on it. And that is then exported as the Pax Romana expands. You can expand that into the history of the imperial conquests of the 1500s, for instance. You go to Central and South America, and you've got conquests where the kings of Portugal and Spain are going in with letters patent from the Pope to take those lands with any violence that's necessary for the kings of Portugal and Spain and the church. And what taking those lands meant was to extinguish all the narratives and news agencies, protocols and practices that were part of the cultures already there. It meant burning the vast libraries of Mayan knowledge that existed. It meant slaughtering all the priests, killing anyone who was literate, so that if any of that literature survived, no one would know how to read it, because the agenda was to delete and replace, delete the old stories, which were stories of paleo contact and genetic engineering by ET visitors in the deep past. This was all part of the Mayan story. Get rid of that, replace it with Christian orthodoxy. And that's just one example of a very percussive moment of deliberate forgetting of our true past and replacing with a neat and tidy Christian orthodox story. And that story repeats all around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what, when England, if you like, was, colonized by Romans or whoever came along that wanted to wipe out the Druid practices and all of the rituals, and they changed all the, the days and laid over their own saints' days on the same days to make that transition, didn't they? Get people thinking about it in a different way.
They did, that's right. And then they built their churches on the Druidic sites.
Yes.
So that if you wanted to go to the old temple, you'd find you're now standing in the middle of a Catholic mass.
Yeah, yeah. So is this, I mean, there have been many iterations apparently where, there's been a population on this planet and then it's been completely wiped out. And then it's later on, it started again. And goodness knows how many of those, there have been, because we just don't have the evidence, I would imagine. But it seems to me, I mean, we live in a world now that is full of anger and warfare, and we're seeing a wonderful play out of all of that now. Would you say then that, at our heart, we are different? We are not this warlike race that we are seeing, but we have been so conditioned and driven and controlled in a certain direction that this is how we've developed and we've forgotten who we are.
Yes, I think what you said is very profound. I think that's right. I think that we have forgotten who we are. And I think that this is part of what Robert Kirk was saying about you can't understand the world until you understand there's a non-human layer. And I think the history of war is a good place to go to get your head around that. There are some really interesting moments when a couple of presidents of the United States of America in the 20th century did their best to warn the public about a layer of influence over human affairs that was beyond government and that was there to foment war and to profit from war. And they said it in rather vague, sepulchral terms, but indicating that there is something above the authority of national governments that foments war. And there's an interesting moment in the Bible, for instance, when one of the prophets, the prophet Micaiah, remote views this committee that appears to be running Project Earth. And it's not a committee of human beings. It's a community of non-human beings, of powerful ones who we could call a sky council. And apparently one of their main jobs is to foment war on planet Earth. Well, you don't need to stick in the Bible to find that narrative. You can go to the source narratives, the Sumerian-based cultures of Babylon, the Akkadian narratives, the Assyrian narratives, that sky council that foments war, it's in those stories too. Go to the Vedas, you'll find it there. Go to the Norse stories, the ancient Greek stories, it's there too. And from time to time, I think we get hints that the history of violence and warfare on planet Earth has a non-human influence at play. I think for me, there's a really poignant moment from the First World War that's called the Christmas Truce, where Christmas Day arrived and the working class boys of Germany remembered on that day that they had no argument with the working class boys of England. Yeah. They didn't want to kill each other. They had no argument with each other. They just wanted to be young men and play soccer together. And so on Christmas Day, they gave themselves permission to stop war for a day and to play soccer, which they did, came out of their trenches, they played with each other, and then they went back into the trenches and the war continued the next day. Just a little reminder that this wasn't a story of two nations clashing in those trenches. The argument was at an elite level. The argument was to do with who had governance over which territory. These were elite questions, and an argument within a single family when you go to the root of it. And then you ask, where did the money come from to finance this? And again, there's a very dark layer to the story. And you think, how can decisions be made with so little empathy towards human beings that it would be decided this kind of slaughter would be the best way forward? And it's as you dig into some of those questions, I think that you find it unavoidable to get into the territory that Robert Kirk described. You get into the non-human layer of why human beings are marshaled in this way. And I mean, we're talking at the extreme end of the spectrum of warfare, but I think even if you go to our basic concept of leadership, why is it that when we talk about strong leadership, what that means to most people is leadership with very little empathy in it? That's leadership that will force a policy through no matter who it hurts, no matter who's against it. It will be pushed through. But why is that strong leadership? Why don't we call it strong leadership if somebody says, we are going to listen to everyone who's going to be affected and consider all possibilities, and we won't make a decision until we're all in agreement? That's far harder to do, but it's not called strong leadership. No. People will say, well, that's no leadership at all.
That's
Where
weak.
do we get that idea? That's weak leadership. And I think we have that framework because our original experience of governance was of being governed by beings who had no fellow feeling towards us, who had no empathy, who would foment war with zero concern at the human collateral that would be caused by this warmongering. I think that's our original experience. And then we inherited those patterns and that culture. And that's part of what I examine in the Scars of Eden. And I use that language, the scars, because that's a scar in our psyche.
It is.
That we think of leadership that way, that we give our power away to superiors, that we're wired for servitude and to follow orders, even if it means we start killing ourselves or killing each other. That is a scar in our psyche from the deep past, a time of paleocontact. But I want to add to that if you listen to ancestral narratives, world mythologies, first contact is not that kind. First contact is not where human beings are marshaled for war and manipulated and slaughtered. First contact stories are about a benevolent contact that elevates humanity, that shows us who we are and what we're capable of. And that's really my agenda in going to this territory, to remind the reader, to remind us that we are capable of something far more beautiful and far more amazing than perhaps we've ever thought.
Absolutely. And, we're watching it playing out in England, in America, with elections, etc. People say they want truth, they want integrity, they want honesty. And then when they get it, they call that person weak. And they out them. Yeah. Yes,
that's right. It's not a neat and tidy world, of course, that emerges with honesty and collaborative leadership. But I think that is the pathway to a better human experience.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break now, Paul. You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is researcher, speaker, former minister, and internationally best-selling author Paul Anthony Wallis, whose books, interviews, and documentaries probe the world's mythologies for their insights into human origins and human potential. Still to come, secret messages. Why are the military, intelligence, and other government agencies so interested in archaeology? And why did Carl Sagan give a secret code word to Edgar Mitchell and the crew of Apollo 14? We'll be back with more from Paul Wallis after this break.
Times TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. Paul, you spoke about, erasing everything as much as possible, the information. We're also seeing around the world that many sacred sites are being destroyed, built over, looted, etc. You've talked about how this is happening in Australia with some of the sacred Aboriginal sites. We've seen ISIS destroying some of the precious, sites in the Middle East. You talk about the Gilgamesh find during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when several units were tasked with obtaining artifacts from archaeological sites and removing them. We've all heard about the, what is that? Trying to think of the guy's name, Trevor somebody who wrote the Spear, the book about Spear and Destiny. And there's supposed to be a famous spear and other things that Hitler had that were appropriated after the war. And nobody's ever heard of them again. What is going on there?
But that's the question, isn't it? What is going on? Why would our governments be interested in archaeological artifacts or artifacts that seem to belong to the world of mythology? They would not be interested unless there was some kind of power residing in that information or in those artifacts. I really started getting onto this after I'd published Escaping from Eden, and I started to be contacted by people who were veterans of war, who had been in the theaters of war, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they had come back, as many veterans of war are, dislocated from mainstream society and the mainstream narrative because they had seen through the conventional geopolitical story. They'd come back asking, why were we really there? What were we really looking for? And I started hearing from people who were talking to me about ancient technology, that there were units in Iraq, for instance, looking for very specific ancient technology to sequester it. And if they could, remove it from the country and put it in the power of, I say the Allies, in the power of the United States. And they were very specific about what that technology was. And people would contact me and say, what is the credibility of that? Because this is what I've heard from friends of mine who are in other units, or this is what I had eyes on. I just need a context for what I saw. And so I will tell them about the ancient technology that's referenced in the Bible, the ancient technology that's referenced in the Sumerian stories, technology which, if you were a warfaring nation, might be very interesting to you. Or simply, if you want to be the top nation on planet Earth, technology that you must have, that nobody else must have. And we have ancient stories about these things, but we have contemporary warfare that is about these things. I mean, if you stop and think for one moment, why was it so important that in the first 10 days of our incursion into Iraq in 2003, that we had to have units there at the Gilgamesh site to sequester items from there? Why was that so far forward in the mix of that war? So these were the questions I began to ask as I had contact with people who were involved in these things. And I think that's what it boils down to, that if you're going to be the top nation, you must have the top tech that's available in the present, tech that was available in the deep past. And that's where some of these stories come together.
Well, I wonder about gold. Gold is a commodity that is supposed to be the precious metal on earth, the most expensive. Only the very rich, can have access to it. And when you look back at the stories from Zechariah Sitchin, of Enki and Enlil, who supposedly came to this planet and were mining gold because they needed gold for some purpose, you wonder whether there's a connection there.
Well, indeed, what is our fascination with gold? It's hinted in the Bible as well, that mining story, the idea that our ancestors were mining for another non-human demographic. One of the things they were interested in was gold. That's mentioned in the book of Genesis. I think that there's a thread through the Bible as well that will surprise people. If let me start somewhere else. Let me start in Wales. I used to watch a story called Nog in the Nog, which was a lovely cartoon about the Dark Ages in Wales and these people and their local griffin, which is a dragon. And I used to think that was what the dragon stories were, lovely, cozy stories that you'd tell as a bedtime story for a child. Well, Nog in the Nog is actually part of a worldwide family of narratives about a time when human beings were governed over by reptilian entities who had enormous appetite for beef, virgin girls, and gold. And it might surprise people to know that many of the God stories in the Bible fit lock, stock, and barrel into that framework. That there is an entity that now has the name of God pasted over the top of the story, that had charge of human colonies and that sat in luxury in its dark tent, receiving prodigious volumes of beef, virgin girls, and gold. And the people's job was to provide their dragon with those things. Why would it be that the ancient Hebrews would have that story, and the Egyptians, and the Chinese, and the Spanish, and the Russians, and the Welsh with this Nog in the Nog, or the version I watched anyway? Why would you dream that up? And I think gold fits within that narrative, that it is something that is precious to somebody else who we used to serve. And that when we came out of that period of history where we were governed over by non-human entities and then human monarchies took over, and by the way, that's the Gilgamesh story, that's the pivot point in the Sumerian story, Gilgamesh, the hybrid king who bridges us to human governance. That moment of exchange of power is there in cultural stories all around the world. So then, after that pivot, the gold belongs to the royal families. And so when you look at the story of colonization, whether it's the British colonizing or the Portuguese or the Spanish or the Dutch, it always involves the removal of gold from the conquered country to the possession of the royal family of the conquering power. What is that about? It's an inherited pattern from the draconian stories of our deep past. And so I think the short answer is that gold is something very precious to non-human species for reasons we might not know, and that we've inherited that interest because it was our job for so long to provide the higher-ups with all the gold they needed.
Yes, absolutely. I enjoy fantasy novels, and over again in any novel that has dragons in it, you hear how little regard they have for humans because they're like flies. Their lifespan is so tiny. Why even bother with them? They're
Yes.
only good for serving them. That's their only purpose. Uh, very interesting how all of this plays out in our culture in so many different ways and influences, our movies, our literature, just about everything.
Exactly. And gold is still a signal of being higher up, isn't it?
Mm,
I mean, you
yeah.
go into a royal court, there'll be plenty of the gold there to tell you you've entered the place of power. And
Yes.
of course,
Yes.
it's there within the churches as well. You're in the place
Yeah.
of
Of
power.
course. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. What a great number has been done on the human race over the millennia. L- Let's
It
move on
has.
and talk about disclosure because you've got some really interesting information in the book. One of the things you talk about is, the Brigadier General, the former chief of Israel's military space security program, who met the press, and I think this is available on YouTube, this video, with a statement acknowledging not just off the world technology, but also an intergalactic council awaiting the right time to self-disclose. You write about Edgar Mitchell and also astrophysicist Carl Sagan. And, one of the things that intrigued me was what you wrote about him talking to the crew of Apollo 14 and giving them a keyword in case they encountered extraterrestrials. How would Carl Sagan know that? How would he know? Who created that keyword?
Yes, it's very interesting because Carl Sagan's, what people remember Carl Sagan for was being like the ultimate scientist. He was skeptical of everything that could not be proven on a scientific basis. And it was in that way that he would discuss the cosmos in which we live. And he was a really inspirational figure to me as a young boy and to many around the world. Many people have gone into astrophysics and cosmology because of Carl Sagan. And I remember a moment when Carl Sagan went on TV and debunked Eric von Daniken, who was the sort of the granddaddy of paleo contact. Eric
Mm.
von Daniken wrote the book Chariots of the Gods, which suggested that our history as a species might make better sense if we allow for the possibility our ancestors may have had contact with ET civilizations who nudged us forward in our development. That made sense to me as an 11-year-old boy when I read the book. And then Eric von Daniken is debunked by Carl Sagan, this ultimate scientist, who says that the likelihood of ET species coming and colonizing us and hybridizing with us was as likely as him hybridizing with a petunia, and everybody laughed. Now I discover through my research for the Scars of Eden, Carl Sagan agreed with 90% of what Eric von Daniken was putting forward in his central thesis. Carl Sagan had argued for it in the 1960s, written papers about it, co-authored a book about it. And Eric von Daniken quoted from those sources when he wrote Chariots of the Gods. But by the time Chariots of the Gods was charting and becoming popular, Carl Sagan had decided that he would do better in terms of tenure and influence if he just put all that to one side and focused on something slightly different. And so for a while, I was quite annoyed with Carl Sagan because I thought he was deeply, deeply dishonest.
Mm.
Now I've forgiven him a bit because I've realized that you take the whole story of his life, you watch the movie Contact, which is his only novel, and you begin to get a sense of what Carl Sagan really believed, even if he couldn't present it as science. And this story of Carl Sagan being the one to brief the Apollo astronauts just before they leave for the moon to say, now you may find yourself in company. And if you do, please don't announce it publicly. Use the word grandma. And then we at HQ know you've got ETs with you and no one else will know. So that's how into the probability of contact Carl Sagan was privately. All the while publicly, he's laughing, mocking, debunking it. But I think in his own way, he did nudge us forward, because we have him to thank for SETI, which just keeps on the agenda the question of, are we in company? It may be a huge distraction because he already knows we're in contact, or he's now passed away, of course, but at least it kept it on the boil, it kept it discussed. And so it's a really complex picture that involves Carl Sagan. Ed Mitchell, far more straightforward, that he campaigned tirelessly for the US government to come clean about being in contact. And when you realize that Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, was bound by layers and layers of official secrets laws, so you know there was a heap of stuff he was not allowed to say, yet he was allowed to say that. He was allowed to campaign for that. So when Hayam Eshed, the former chief of space security for Israel, the brigadier general who held that position for 27 years, when he stepped forward a couple of Christmases ago and said, yes, we have been in contact at a covert government level for quite some time, he was repeating what Ed Mitchell had wanted to hear from US authorities. And he was also repeating what our ancestors have been telling us for thousands of years. Intergalactic Council, read Sky Council. It's the same thing. And it's what we find in the Bible, the Sumerian stories, and ancestral story all around the world.
So if this is common knowledge, you know, amongst a certain group of people in government, when are we going to hear about it? You know, we keep being told disclosure is close. There's all kinds of hints that are being given. We're watching NASA do things that, you know, they've never done before and announce information. The military, you know, when are they going to tell the truth?
Well, I think if we're waiting for the moment when the president of the USA steps forward and says, my fellow Americans, I got something I want to tell you, I think it's a fool's errand. I don't think that moment's going to come. I think instead we have a drip, a soft disclosure to habituate us to the idea we might have company, so that if it becomes blindingly obvious, well, most of us have already worked it out. And there's quite a lot of soft disclosure happening right now. It all accelerated really in 2017 when Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, leaked the Pentagon's footage of the USS Nimitz engagement with the UAPs, the Tic Tacs, as we call them. That was leaked in 2017. 2019, the Pentagon authenticates it, says, yes, those were UFOs. And yes, we have had a unit in place for 70 years investigating physical materials retrieved from UFO crashes. Yes, everybody, that was in the news. And then that increased the pressure for the Senate briefings. The Senate says to the Pentagon, we want to know everything you know about UFOs. And so this thin paper, 9 pages of what looked like absolute whitewash came out last year. And then that led to the congressional hearings. Now the Pentagon is saying it set up a new unit to investigate UFOs, which we now call UAPs. The language keeps changing, but it is the same thing. So there's been a lot that's now in the public domain. The Pentagon has authenticated the UFO phenomenon for the first time in 70 years. And in that thin report of 9 pages was the information that US defense operations are interfered with on average once every 6 weeks by UFOs. And that's been the rate over the last 17 years from 2004. So there's some significant information that's suddenly been put out there. UFO crashes, physical materials, once every 6 weeks. Well, that's a lot of contact. And so I think if people are paying attention and not too distracted by other things, they realize we have been told we are in contact at that level. And then listen to Hayam Eshed And it makes perfect sense that in 70 years, we would have found something out that we might actually be in some kind of a conversation, which he says we were. Ed Mitchell says we have been. The US is very involved in it. It was over a decade ago that Dmitry Medvedev, the previous prime minister of Russia, said exactly the same thing. He said every new prime minister of Russia is given a dossier detailing the spacefaring civilizations that we're already in contact with. So the information is already out there for those who are paying attention, and out there enough that if it suddenly becomes blindingly obvious, the governments of the world can say, well, don't you remember we told you about this in 2019 or in 2022?
But being in contact with and being part of an intergalactic council are not the same thing. Do you think that, governments on this planet are part of that council, or are they lesser?
Well, that's the great question, isn't it? Are we present on the council? Who's representing us on the council? In whose interests are decisions being taken? So on and so forth. That's why I think it's important to bring this out into the public domain. People might say, what power could we possibly have on an intergalactic council? Because if they've got the tech to get here, then they have tech we don't understand. We are like a mouse agreeing to be eaten by a lion if we look at the power dynamics of us on that council, surely. But then I take courage from stories of paleo contact that tell us that in the beginning, we were nurtured by ET cousins, that the people who came from Sirius and from the Pleiades are our distant cousins. We're all related, and they came to support humanity. If they supported us in the deep past, I believe they support us in the present. I believe that their experience of contact all around the world, that would confirm that idea. So I think our place on the Intergalactic Council has to be a place of intelligent diplomacy, that we have friends on that council, that we have friends who come from the stars who are there to support Project Humanity, and we need to think carefully about where we sit on that table. And I think there have been stories from times past that suggest that that really is the name of the game. It's not that we can start saying this is our planet, we say what happens here. No, we need to nurture our friendships with our cosmic neighbors, because then we're part of a block. Then we can't just be snuffed out just like that.
But not all of them are benevolent. I mean, there have been some that are and some that aren't. So, what we're seeing playing out on this planet right now with everybody at war with one another is just going to be out there on a grander scale.
Yes, that's right. Not all of them are benevolent. That's true. And that's certainly part of our ancestral stories as well. It's also part of the story that is furthest forward in the mix at present. The reason that we now have a new unit that the Pentagon has owned up to publicly is because we are talking about our cosmic neighbors as a military threat, because that's how you get buy-in at a political level. That's how you get dollars in the program. If they're a military threat, we don't want that. Yeah. We want to be sovereign. And so I do think the darker end of the story is often talked up for that reason. And I mean, if I use the word alien, in most people's minds, they'll immediately think Mars attacks, Independence Day, invasion of the body snatchers. That's where we go straight away. And so I do like to balance that picture and say that's not all there is to life in the cosmos.
Yeah. Well, we're almost at the end of our time, Paul. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm glad we're going to continue it in a couple of months' time with your third book, Echoes of Eden.
That's right.
Yes, what secrets of human potential were buried with our ancestors' memories of ET contact. We did touch upon a little bit about, our higher cognitive powers and the things that you're going to be talking about in that book in our first conversation, but it will be good to hear the rest of it.
Definitely. I'll look forward to that.
Paul Wallis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sandie. It's been a real pleasure.
Always. We've been discussing the revelations in book 2 of Paul Anthony Wallis's Eden Trilogy, which comprises Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, and Echoes of Eden. And you can find more information about these books and Paul's healing and coaching services at his website, paulanthonywallis.com. And you can find more interviews and documentaries on ancient revelations on the Fifth Kind TV channel that Paul hosts on YouTube. And finally, stay tuned for news of episode 3 of this conversation, in which Paul will be sharing more from his third book, Echoes of Eden. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back with you again at the same time next week with another edition of What is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.